And I remember this footballer came up to me and grabbed me around the neck and was saying,
"Hello, and welcome to the MediaNord podcast. My name is Skjalg, and I'm going to be the host moving forward. I'm a student here at Nord. I study film and TV, and today's guest is going to be the esteemed director-producer Richard Hearsey, who works as a teacher here at Nord. He's going to be talking to us about, some of his work history, a little bit of tips and tricks for getting started in the industry, and some projects to keep an eye on. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the MediaNord podcast. My name is Skjalg, and I'll be your host for today. And with me, I've got Richard Hearsey. Hello, Richard.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm okay.
Yeah, I'm feeling fine.
Yeah.
Not freaked out by the isolated space we find ourselves in? Not confined?
Oh, I've been in worse than this.
Yeah, sure you have. So, Richard, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your career looking like? What do you work at?
What's my career looking?
Yeah.
What do you mean? You want to know where I started?
Well, yeah, let's take it back.
Back in, I think it was 1975, I was doing in those days it was called a Bachelor in Photographic Arts in London at what is now the University of Westminster. Bachelor in Photographic Arts basically covered photography and film. And after the first semester, I suppose, you specialised in one or the other, and I specialised in film. And at that time, the BBC would take university students for not necessarily work experience, but to fill in for people who went on holiday. They called it holiday relief work. So in 75, I managed to get my first job at the BBC in London while still at university. So it was Easter holidays, summer vacation, Christmas holidays. And I must have done something right because they kept asking me to go back. And it was a fairly menial job, but I still think it was one of the best jobs I've ever done. It basically involved coming in every day, going to the BBC library and being given index cards. Bear in mind, there were no computers at that stage. And the index cards would have films. The BBC at that time, when they used to do television shows or TV dramas, would always do a tele-recording. And the tele-recording would be basically what it sounds like. It would be recorded on film with a separate sound roll to go with it. And you would go into the library, which looked like the end of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of whatever, this huge warehouse, and you would climb up a ladder and you would pull out these film cans. And then you would go down to these little rooms and you'd get your coffee and you'd have your cigarettes and you'd sit there and watch these tele-recordings and you'd make notes on an index card, and that would be your job. So every day you were basically paid by the BBC to go and watch stuff. And also while I was there, and I've told people in the past, it's important to make connections. When I was at a place called Television Film Studios in Meyling, and they were filming Doctor Who. So you would come out for a coffee break or a cigarette, and there would be a Dalek would go past or a Cyberman would walk past. And I got to meet many of the Doctor Who's, the actors who played Doctor Who. And then years later, when I eventually became a producer and director, I had those people on other shows I did, and I kept in touch with those people. A lot of them are sadly dead, but some of them are still alive now. And I met other producers. I used to go over to Television Centre as much as I could to see studio recordings. I would hang out. All the TV companies in those days had their own bar, and everybody used to congregate in the bar, not just the talent, but the crews and everybody else. And it was a way of meeting people, and I would constantly be sort of sitting down with people. They probably got pissed off with me, but I would be asking them all sorts of questions about the cameras and, how they got certain guests in and how the sets were developed. And I sort of met a lot of people who I'm still in touch with today. And that's how it it sort of started. Obviously, I had to finish my university training, because in those days, also to get into the BBC, it required a university degree anyway. It doesn't now. And when I finished, I got offered a job at the BBC in London. I'd applied to go to Bristol because that's where my parents were, outside Bristol. And I got offered a job in London. But I also got offered a job in Southampton at an independent company, and decided I wanted to get out of London and move nearer to the sea, I suppose, and went and worked in Southampton as an assistant film editor. And then that turned into a film editor, again, working on a large range of stuff, all different genres, from news and current affairs, children's, sport, documentaries, dramas. And then one of the producer directors there gave me an opportunity to become a researcher, which I didn't really know what a researcher does. But I was a researcher on a very famous UK kids program, TV program, which when I joined it had probably been running for about 15 years. I worked on that. And when I finished that, instead of going back to the film department, News and Current Affairs offered me a job as a production journalist. And that's when I started working on a regular daily news and magazine program. And I was responsible for the music guests, news, current affairs, anything really that happened. And I worked on that. I can't remember how many years I worked on that, for a few years. And then I saw a job advertised back in London in an entertainment department at what was then classed as the best TV entertainment company. And I applied for the job, and there were 700 people applied, and there were only 2 jobs, and they offered me one of the jobs as a researcher. And within 6 months, they had made me an associate producer. I didn't ask. They just said, we're going to make you an associate producer, which was basically a way of giving me a bit more money and a bit more responsibility, but virtually the same job. And then the producer and then the director I was working with sort of had nervous breakdowns because of the pressure of work. You know, we were working 7 days a week, and the normal days could be 18-hour days or longer. And I was living about 75 miles away from London, so I was coming in on the train every day. But when I finished late at night, 11 o'clock, they provided you with a taxi home, and you could sleep in the taxi. Anyway, this producer and director gave it up, and I was made up to producer and director, and then I never really looked back after that. And I just continued to produce, obviously, series producing and exec producing. And that went on for a long time. I ended up moving back to Southampton for a couple of years as an exec producer and producer, and then went back to London when a new company opened, and mainly did comedy entertainment at that point, along with Disney and stuff like that. And then I was approached by an international company which represented TV formats worldwide. And the money was too good to turn around. And I thought, this will be interesting, traveling the world, telling people how to make programs. So I did that, and that company ended up being Fremantle, who were based in America. And I suppose one of my dreams was to always work in Hollywood, and that opened up that avenue, where I ended up working at Sony and CBS and NBC and places like that, going backwards and forwards to America, doing pilots and doing shows over there, but also traveling the world and going to other places. And, I can remember it was probably round about maybe 85 or maybe later, I came to Norway to show them how to make a show we'd done in the UK. So I was in and out of Oslo. I never went anywhere else. I came to Oslo. And I was doing that until a point where a couple of guys from Switzerland approached me and said, would I like to run my own company? And I thought, well, if I don't do it now, I'll probably regret it later. So we set up my company in London, which was called Ronin Entertainment. And I then, I suppose for the next 5 years, was making programs and also running the company, small company. But it was pretty successful. But I got fed up with the business side of it. I wanted to produce more. So then I decided, okay, I'm going to wrap this up and go back to freelancing. And eventually the industry changed a lot back in 2008. And I got a bit despondent with the industry and the way it was going. There seemed to be too many of these talent shows and stuff. You know, Simon Cowell is classed as being this fantastic producer and, you know, Britain's Got Talent and American Idol and stuff like that. Talent shows started in America in the 40s, so they're nothing new. They're just revamped. But of course, younger people, you know, they see these programs and they go, oh, this is brilliant, but they don't know the history behind them. And I just got bored with it. I got bored with dancing programs and talent shows because I'd done those for years. And I was approached to go and teach in the Philippines, of all places. And I thought, that sounds like, could be quite fun. Could be like a holiday for 6 months. I'd never been to the Philippines. So I went there for 6 months and ended up stuck there for 6 years teaching, which was great. And that's where I met a friend of mine called Greg Curda. And Greg was from America and a well-known sound ADR guy, really. And he came over to Norway, and then they were looking for somebody to come to Norway, and he called me up, and I did a sort of video interview, and they hired me to come into Norway to teach. But I still keep my hand. People from the UK still approach me with ideas, and, you know, I've been approached while I've been in Norway to go back and, you know, will you come back and do this quiz show? And I'm like, do I really want to go back and work 7 days a week, churning out 5 or 6 shows a day? And I don't really. I've sort of done that. I'm happy to go in and teach people how to do it, but I don't really want to be the person who physically does it. But, you know, we've been lucky in Norway when John Cleese came over. He did 2 shows in Trondheim, and I contacted him and said, could we come down and shoot the shows? So the students manned the cameras and we recorded his show. Bill Bailey, another comic who I'd worked with 30 years before, he came over. He was in Trondheim. We did his show. So, you know, there are opportunities occasionally for me to get back in there and work with people. And funnily enough, we did the And Action Festival last year. There was a guy called Tony McHale, who I first worked with in '83 when he was an actor on a hidden camera show. And then since that time, he ended up being a creator of a long-running BBC drama in the UK. He wrote for something called EastEnders. He's written books. And I had an idea. I'd read something about an idea that involved France and Norway, actually. And I talked to him while he was here about it. And since then, we've developed that as an 8-part drama series set in Norway, Sweden, and the UK. And at the moment, it's out at a couple of broadcasters and a couple of producer friends of mine, one of them in Sweden. Actually, 2 of them in Sweden. One of them was the woman that was involved with The Bridge, the Swedish-Danish version of The Bridge. And also it's in the UK at the moment. And what we're trying to do is get 3 countries involved with it. It's a crime procedural, basically. You know, and I have been involved with drama in the past, but obviously I sort of was more into comedy entertainment and sketch shows and stuff like that, as well as game shows and big entertainment shows. But I think a lot of the Scandinavian dramas are really good, and a lot of the BBC ones try and emulate that, and some of them works, others don't. And he's come up with a really good treatment, about a 25-page treatment for this series. So again, we'll see what happens with that. But that's, I probably went on a bit too long, but that sort of, there's a lot more I could tell you about, you know, how I moved on. It sounds fairly easy how it happened. And looking back, it probably was a bit easier than it is now.
Yeah, no, that's entirely likely. But yeah, you mentioned production there a good bit. For people who don't know, give us the skinny on what goes into production.
Depends. I suppose a lot depends on what genre you're looking at. You know, if it's a TV entertainment show, you know, the first thing that will happen is you'll have a format or a proposal or a treatment, or you'll have the basic idea. And then as a producer, I would then look at that and I would work out, okay, how am I going to make this? Am I going to make 2 shows a day? Am I going to try and make 4 shows a day? Because obviously the more shows you can make in a day, you're bringing the cost down. If you're renting a studio for 1 day, it's quite costly, certainly in central London. So if you can make 4 shows a day, you're amortizing the cost. And then you would look at it and I would work back and I would go, how much pre-production do I think I need? And I would sort of maybe go, okay, I might need 8 weeks pre-production on this. How much production? Okay, I'm going to make 2 shows a day, 5 days a week. That's 10. They want 20, so that's going to be 2 weeks of production. Post-production tends to happen at the same time. So as soon as you come out of a studio, you know, the tapes go into the edit and they start working on it. But you know, with any production, you've got pre-production, production, and then post-production. And then you've got delivery and you've got all the other bits that go with it. But as a producer, you're normally the first person hired and you're the last person to leave. You know, quite often I've had other directors I've worked with and they've gone off on another job as soon as we finish shooting. So they haven't been involved with the edit. And they're, you know, a lot of them are quite happy with that. In films, it's different because the director will stay hopefully right till the end. And the producer is there still cleaning up and doing paperwork and sorting stuff out, checking the budget. You know, the budget is a big part of a producer's job, you know, keeping an eye that you're not going to go over. But then, you know, I've been lucky that I've worked with a lot of really good production managers. And they're the ones that are more into maths than I am. And they're the ones that will, you know, tell me, you need to look at this line in the budget. You're going over on makeup or you're going over on wardrobe or whatever. And then I have to look at the figures and I go, you know, well, we're not going to use as much in that line of the budget, so we'll move the money across. But it's a difficult thing to say what I do in the real world on a day-to-day basis. You know, it can be everything from auditioning people, meeting actors, lots of lunches with people, you know, dealing with companies, trying to get deals on hotels, trying to get deals on, you know, sets, and a lot of production designers and graphic designers, you know, I still know to this day. And if I was doing a pilot, they would be the first people I would contact because I would say, you know, there's this pilot, you know, I'd like you to be involved. There's not a lot of money, but would you like to do it? And then if we get the series, you'll get the gig. And that's, you know, luckily that's turned out positively. Same with post-production. I was lucky there's a company in London called The Farm, one of the best post-production houses. And they would always let me edit a pilot for nothing on the basis of if we get a series, we'll get the work. And that always worked out, well.
Right on. Moving on a little bit to something a little bit different. Do you have any insider tips for people looking to, work in the industry in terms of production and directing?
Tips for getting into production or directing is a difficult one. When I left university, I had friends at university who had said, I want to be a director. Hardly anybody said, I want to be a producer. When I left university, I didn't say, I want to be a director. I didn't know that much about producing either. And I thought my career was going to be in editing. I think if somebody leaves university going, I'm going to be a director, there are exceptions to the rule. Christopher Nolan, not at university, but his jobs in the real world before he started getting the big breaks with all the movies, he worked as a producer, stroke cameraman, stroke editor, stroke director, doing corporate videos. And that would be similar to this. He would turn up in an office building with a couple of cameras and the sound gear, and they'd sit around and wait for, I don't know, Richard Branson to turn up. And then they would do an interview, and then Richard Branson would leave. And that's what he did, and that paid the bills. But what he did then was at weekends, he went out and started making his own movie. So every weekend he was out there shooting a bit more for his first movie. And when he'd finished that, he edited it, and then it went to a festival. And I think it went to Sundance. And at Sundance, somebody came up to him and said, have you got any other ideas? He said, well, I've got this script that I've been working on called Memento. And they said, okay, we'll fund it. And that was how he got into the business. Another friend of mine is a guy called Mark Forster, who a lot of people may not be familiar with, but he was responsible for a film called Monsters Ball, which he did straight out. He went to UCLA, I think, and he came out and he did Monsters Ball with Halle Berry, which she got an Oscar for. And then he was hired, or he was given a 3-picture deal by Harvey Weinstein, of all people, at Miramax. But he went on to do Quantum of Solace. He went on to do Finding Neverland with Johnny Depp. So he's done a large number of films, but it was his film that went to Sundance again, which got him that deal. Kevin Smith, most people know the story, that he self-financed Clerks with his credit cards. Again, it was Harvey Weinstein at Sundance who saw it eventually, gave him a picture deal, and that took him into that. So, one way for directors is to go, it's much easier nowadays with cameras. I was looking at Filmic Pro on my iPhone, and I can do a split screen on it. So if I was interviewing somebody, I can have both feeds recorded on an iPhone. And we've seen there are a lot of people out there, and they go, our feature film was made on an iPhone. Okay, yeah, it was made on an iPhone, but they still needed professional sound gear and they still needed a lot of equipment. Nowadays, if somebody wants to be a director, my advice is to go out there and start shooting stuff, come up with a really good script. For the other people who want to get into the business, my advice is you get your foot in the door anywhere you can. Even if you get a job as a runner. I've always employed, on productions, I've always employed a lot of young people. There's a friend of mine, she's a friend now. She was the daughter of a friend of mine who happened to be a high court judge, who I worked with when I was a journalist, when he was a solicitor, and he did my house conveyancing and stuff like that. And his stepdaughter was coming up to her summer break, and he rang me up and he said, is there any way you could give Lara a job for the summer? Because he knew I was filming all summer. And I said, yeah, sure. So I hired her as a runner, and she was getting coffee, and she was, doing what a runner does, anything. She went on to have a career as a weather girl, doing the weather forecast for Channel 5. And now she works for BBC on a program called BBC Click, which I think we get in Norway. And she's a presenter on that. So she went that route. Other friends of mine came in there was one guy I employed he basically had a Xerox certificate for photocopying of all things. He came in as a runner. He's now a producer. Two others are first ADs. They came in as runners. And what happens is, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about when I was first at the BBC. I used to hang around people, not in a strange stalking way, but I would, introduce myself to people and ask them about, their acting, or ask them about, the camera work, or ask them about sound, or ask them about set design. And luckily people were always, nobody I think ever turned around and went, no, we're not telling you. It wasn't a sort of protective thing. The same as I am. If somebody says to me, okay, well, how would you go about doing that? I'll tell them. And I think that's the important part. If you get your foot in the door, it's not making yourself a nuisance, but it's observing and seeing what goes on. And yeah, okay, you may have to get the macchiatos and the lattes, but if you can sit in on production meetings and see what goes on, and see how script editors work, and see how the script is developed, and follow the process through, I think that helps a lot. You get a better understanding. The other thing is never saying no to anybody when they ask you to do something. And I think that was one of the things when I first joined London Weekend Television as a researcher, and one of the reasons I think they bumped me up to associate producer over other people who'd been researchers there a lot longer than me, was I never said no. It was like, if they came to me at 6 o'clock in the evening and said, we've got a problem. There was one time they had a problem. They wanted to, for a show we were doing called Surprise, Surprise, they wanted to put together the English 66 World Cup squad and get them all in the studio. And the show was about 3 days later. And my then boss came into the office, and other people were like, right, I'm going home now. I'm going to the pub. And he looked at me and said, we've got a problem. We need this. Will you be happy to stay? Yeah, sure. And I ended up sleeping under the desk that night. But it was, at that time, there was no internet. So it was mostly on the phone, trying to track down these people, being told to fuck off by a footballer called Alan Ball. There was another guy I met at that time who I stayed very much in touch with, was a very famous footballer in the UK, probably people don't know now, called George Best. He died a few years ago. But I got him involved as well, along with the majority of the football squad. And then I remember on the night, we took them to Highbury Football Ground to have a kick around live into the studio. And then we had to get them on a bus and get them back to the studio. And I remember as well, I'd had to pay George Best more than I was paying the others. And I'd said to George, whatever you do, don't tell anybody. And one of the goalkeepers, I can't remember his name, found out. And we were in the hospitality suite, which was on the top floor of London Weekend Television in the bar. And I remember this footballer came up to me and grabbed me around the neck and was saying, I just heard that we're not all getting paid the same amount, which was a lesson for me that you have to pay people the same. I'm not talking about films, because on films there is a disparity on there, and we've read about, certain actors getting a lot more than other actors, things like that. But another thing happened with that, where I was on an entertainment show, and we were filming all through the summer for about 3 years. And the camera assistants and the sound assistants, I'd made a point of telling the production manager they must be on the same rates, same daily rates. And my first day on location, one of the sound assistants, who was by that time, a really good friend of mine, he sort of walked past me in the morning on the way to breakfast, and it was like and I was like, what? What's the matter? Nothing, doesn't matter. I said, come on, what's the problem? He said, you told us we would be on the same rate as the assistant. I said, well, yeah, you are. No, we're not. I went, I'll check into it. So I went and found the production manager. And I said, she said, yeah, I managed to save some money. I said, no, that's not the point. They've got to be on the same daily rate and change it. So she changed it and everything was fine. So it was an example with crews of, people do talk, as much as I've never done that when people say to me, although they did at LWT at one point, another researcher, I was working with 3 other researchers, and they said, what grade are you on? Because in those days, it was like researcher grade 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they called it substantive. And it basically meant there were 5 grades of pay. And when I joined, they offered me grade 2. And I said, I can't afford to do that with the travel from Winchester to London and stuff. So they made me grade 4. Whereas somebody else who came from the BBC, where they'd been earning a lot less money, and we were sat there, and I think in the pub one lunchtime, they said, oh, by the way, what grade are you on? I didn't think about it. I said, oh, I'm on grade 4. And this person's face sort of drained of blood. I said, how did you get grade 4? And I thought, oh, shit, I shouldn't have said anything. So it told me, from then on, not to talk about things like that.
All right. And then for the final question, is there anything coming out in terms of like movies or TV shows that you're looking forward to at the moment?
I'm a big Nicolas Cage fan. So his new movie, Renfield, which has got a really low Rotten Tomatoes score, I'm looking forward to that. I watch an awful lot of, I say TV, but it's not just TV dramas and series and things like that. I watch a lot of movies as well, as and when they come out. I watched a thing last night. It was a 3-part series it was a true story, but it was a dramatized story about a ex-nightclub bouncer from Newcastle who spent 4 months in prison for abusing a 9-year-old boy, which I think 4 months is nothing. He should have stayed in there. And when he came out, he threatened he was going to hurt his ex-girlfriend. He ended up shooting her new boyfriend and killing him and wounding her, and then shot a policeman. And it was a true story, but it was a dramatized story, 3 parts, quite horrific, but really well done. I mean, I say it a lot of the time. I watch stuff, and my baseline is, was I entertained by that? Did it entertain me in some way? So, films, if we look at movies I can watch over and over again and are everything from Steve McQueen's Bullet, Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, Home Alone. Those films, Galaxy Quest, which a very famous playwright and writer in the UK, David Mamet, says is the most perfect film ever, which may sound strange. Galaxy Quest is a comedy space film loosely based on Star Trek. But if you look at it and you analyze it, it is a really well thought out film. So those things are entertaining. John Wick, I find entertaining. Mission Impossibles, I find some of them I find more entertaining than others. Another film from last year, probably Top Gun Maverick, I think is a really solid film. It's my telltale sign is if I'm watching a movie and I start pausing it to look at my phone or pausing it to go and get a coffee or a glass of wine or something. If I can sit and watch that movie, throughout, then for me, I've been entertained by it. The same with TV dramas. I think people can learn a lot by very good TV serial dramas, which tend to be police procedurals. The Bridge. The Bridge was 5 seasons, 5 series, outstanding TV production. Then they did the UK did a UK version of it, and they called it The Tunnel. And they made, they took the first scripts and did it in the Channel Tunnel as the first one. Wasn't nearly as good. Still okay, but, and then in the UK, you've got things like Broadchurch, which are excellent, Shetland, Line of Duty, all these police procedurals, which the public don't seem to be able to get enough of. If we were talking, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I only like, old movies that I'll watch over and over again. There are movies that I would say are probably the best movies that have ever been made, and that would include things like Citizen Kane. It would include The Godfather, as 2 examples. Goodfellas, probably. Serpico with Al Pacino. Actually, majority of things with Al Pacino are pretty good. Robert De Niro. I was fortunate again because I was able to span what we call the pond, i.e. between the UK and America. I was lucky when I was in America that I got to meet a lot of what I would call my heroes, like Whoopi Goldberg. She was doing Hollywood Squares in the next studio to me. And I got invited into their lunchroom to have lunch, and I sat next to Whoopi. And we chatted for probably over an hour about films and acting and stuff like that. And I was lucky that I got to meet a lot of people. Some of them are sadly dead now. But I got to meet a lot of those people who were my heroes as a kid. And the same happened in the UK with a lot of really top actors, performers, variety guys, people who were at the top of their profession. When I started producing, I got to work with these people. And, sometimes I had to pinch myself sometimes. It was like, I used to watch this guy when I was with my mum at home, when I used to come home from school. Now I'm producing this person. And in a lot of cases, it didn't feel real, but and luckily, I became friendly with all those people. And I think that's another thing. It's the way you treat people. To the point, a number of the Doctor Who actors. When I was a kid, I was a big fan of Doctor Who. I can remember the first ever episode of Doctor Who. I haven't watched it in later years, but a lot of the doctors came from obviously the acting profession, but then I would use them in other shows and keep in touch with them that way. It's been, one thing I would say is I wish that every time I sat down with somebody, I'd had a portable recorder. It would be so much easier to do it today. You just put your phone down and record the conversation with them. Because so many of them have passed, and there's no record of interviews with them other than chat shows and stuff like that. I did a radio show once, and I used to invite these sort of guests, 2-hour live radio show, and we just used to talk for 2 hours. And luckily I kept all those, because some of those people have passed as well. I suppose the older you get, you know, people are going to disappear, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's that's a wrap. That's it for everything. So thank you so much for coming in for the interview.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Nothing else you want to know?
No, I'm good. It's always a pleasure to hear from an experienced man, you know.
I'll just add one other bit,
Yeah.
which you can either edit in or you. It comes back to advice about getting into the business. And you guys have heard me say this time and time again, but I'll say it here. You know, my advice is watch as much as possible, you know, the crap stuff as well as the good stuff. Sometimes you might have to force yourself to stick with a TV program or a film. But I think it helps you tremendously because you, whether you know it or not, when you're watching something, you're analyzing it. You know, anybody can watch something and see that actor's not very good, or, you know, it's subconscious. Whereas you can watch other things and go, wow, that person, you know, Tom Hardy. If we take Tom Hardy as an example, you know, if you watch him in the majority of stuff he does, he's absolutely excellent. Robert De Niro is excellent in a lot of things. Any earlier films, not so much the later comedies, I don't think. Clint Eastwood early films, Steve McQueen early films, Denzel Washington, you know, a huge breadth of stuff from Denzel Washington. Nicolas Cage, you know, not so much, but he is churning out a huge number of movies. A lot of people may go, yeah, the majority of them are crap, but you've really got to, you know, if you look at Mandy or you look at Pig, if you look at, what was that last one? My daughter's just watched it, The Unbearable, what, da-di-da-di-da-da. You know, it's a comedy film with Pedro Pascal. But then, you know, The Last of Us, for instance, absolutely brilliant, in my view, and worth a watch. The Mandalorian, I love. You know, they're entertaining, but they're really good. So I watch a wide breadth of both movies, TV series, entertainment shows. You know, on BBC Brit in Norway, I love watching Would I Lie to You, 8 Out of 10 Cats. You know, I still get enjoyment out of those. So advice for anybody going into the industry, and I think continuing to do that, is to watch as much as possible. Another bit of advice, if you're applying to a company, any company, and you want to get in, is doing your research. So it's going to their website and looking at every production they've ever done. And if you haven't seen any of them, find it, watch it, so that you can comment on it. Because people, when they're receiving, when I had my own company, I used to get probably 100 letters a day, and I would read them all. But some of them were like, I want a job, you know. Others were talking about stuff that I'd worked on. And that would stand out. And I'd go, oh, they've done their homework. Okay, we'll get them in for an interview. So I think those sort of tips help. But going back to what I said earlier, you know, getting your foot in the door at any level, you're in the industry. Doesn't matter. That's the important part.
Right. Well, thank you so much again.
Okay.
For coming in.
We did thank you earlier.
Yeah, but
that was an extra bit.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the extra bit.
That's the deleted scenes on the DVD.
Yeah.
thank you for tuning into this episode of the MediaNord podcast. Join us again next time, where we invite a special guest to discuss the diversity at Nord University and in the game development industry. We'd also love to hear from you, our listeners, so please reach out to us on social media at MediaNord with your thoughts and feedback.